Stewart Hall, who was a sociologist. He was a Jamaican sociologist, and he ran a fantastic course of cultural studies. He was the head of cultural studies at Birmingham University. He posed this aspect that race is a floating signifier. So what he means by race being a floating signifier is that race goes through these different journeys and amendments over time. Because what has happened in recent years is that the word race and racism has become very uncomfortable amongst those people within the dominant culture, because they felt that they were going to be indicted because they had particular thoughts or feelings or actions towards people of color. So what has happened, you find now, is that we start to use all these different terminologies or phrases in front of race. So people don't like to use racism. You know, in the 1980s and 70s and 60s and 50s, it was called racialism. It became racism round about the latter part of the 1980s into the 90s. It was called racialism. And what has happened where there's racialism, racist, racism, race, anything is then became the R word, a word that sat very uncomfortable with people from the dominant culture. So they started to put terminologies in front of race to downplay their involvement in racial discriminatory practices and prejudicial tendencies, such as institutional racism, structural racism, and the list goes on, scientific racism, systemic racism. All these words in order to divorce themselves from reality. Because when you say institutional racism, it makes it look like it's an institution and not individuals who are involved in constructing that reality. Because there's this concept called game theory. And game theory is based upon designers, advocates, players, and pawns. So designers are people who put the system together, whether it's institutional, whether it's systemic. It's a group of people who put that system together. And then you've got the next groups of people who are the advocates. Okay, the advocates are those people who uphold and support that system, whether it's systemic or institutional. Then the next group are the players. These are the people who are conscious and unconscious about the reality of the existence of those discriminatory practices and prejudicial tendencies within those companies. And obviously the latter ones are the pawns, the way in which the system is set up to restrict or to exclude or to prohibit or to limit elements of upward mobility, flexible mobility within that company. So what Stewart Hall says is that race goes through this journey through time. So from the 1600s onwards, race has taken different forms at different times based upon some of the different subjects and topics which were being used. So for example, this is what he says. So if you put race at the center, race has gone through all these different things as a floating signifier. It floats and it floated within all these different disciplines from the 1600s or as early as the 1500s right up until the present day. So the first one, in order to deal with racial inequalities and stratifications, discriminatory practices, was religion, such as Hinduism, the caste system or the Varna system. Varna means color, Jati means caste. And then we had what came in the Judeo-Christian perspective, which basically looked at the curse of Ham. Ham and his descendant were cursed with dark skin because they looked at the nakedness of Noah. And this is still perpetuated as we speak today. This is not to throw tar or anything against religion. We're looking at the sort of social construction that took place in order to justify one group of people's position within that institution over another group. This is what is important here, because there are many people from those faiths, which I've just mentioned, who don't subscribe to those notions. This must be clear. Then the next stage, about the 1700s, we start to see the element of philosophy started to racialize groups of people. So you had the likes of David Hume, Charles Montesquieu, and the list just goes on, and Kant. Every single one of these European philosophers said something negative about people of color, because the Europeans were going out, colonizing the world, etc., in order to justify the colonization and the genocidal tendencies of massacring people who was fighting and restraining the so-called European powers from taking them and their resources, their minerals and commodities. So this is what philosophers were doing to try to justify to these so-called merchants and pirates that they can do what they're doing, because these people are not people anyway. They're not human beings.